I'll be starting this project with this Knox Deco table base. It's cheating a little bit, but I really like it. I'm not sponsored by these guys. I just saw this table actually somewhere in person and was able to track it down online. The tabletop is going to be made out of 3 10-foot long 4x12 wooden kind of structural beams made of Douglas fir. The wood beams will be glued together, and I'm also gonna pocket the underside and put in these pieces of steel tubing to add some more significant structure to hold the pieces together. To attach the wood beams to these steel tubes, I'm going to use some modified carriage bolts where the head is cut down from rounded to flat so that they'll all be flush on the top side of the table. For the finish, I tried a few different things. I started with a classic penetrating wood stain. That's the top row there. And it just really didn't want to sink in. And I know this is like a cheap wood for furniture, not typically used for this high-end stuff, but I just didn't like it. It wasn't building up. I tried like 4 coats. It just wasn't building up an attractive appearance. So then I went and got this 3X better coverage stain on the bottom row, and I did a coat and it did look a little better, but kind of flat, almost like you're just spreading mud on the surface. And then I did a second coat on the left half just to see if that would improve it, and it just kind of wiped out most of the wood texture. Then I decided to try combining the two, which is the middle piece. I started with a coat of the 3X and then came back with the penetrating wood stain on top of that because I liked the warmth of the penetrating stain. And anyway, it worked great blending the two together. And then on all 3 samples, I coated it with the oil-based polyurethane just to see if that would help. And ultimately, the middle option is what I went with on the table. I 3D printed this fixture and put a dowel pin on there so that I could get consistent hole spacing. That block there is for the very first hole, since I have no existing hole to start with. So put that up against the block, clamp it in place, drill it out, and then that drilled hole will go onto the dowel so that the spacing from hole to hole is consistent along the beam and on all the other beams. Before I glue the wood beams together, I'm going to add graphite into the wood glue. This will make it dark, almost black, so that when I go to stain it, if there's any exposed glue, it won't have issues creating light spots since the wood glue won't absorb the stain. Here's a survey of the wood. We've got knots all over the place on the edges of the boards. We've got some pretty big gaps. These boards were not straight when I glued them together. You can actually see a bit of daylight there at the end. You know, I didn't plane them or join them or anything like that, but I'll fill them in the next step. There's another knot. This one here goes all the way through the table, so this table is going to be epoxy coated, so I need to create a boundary for the epoxy to not flow all the way through and leak out, essentially. This right here is just a knot that's missing, so I've got a void there, which I'll fill. And then, you know, more knots missing, pretty good portion of their material. All that needs to be filled, which will be in the next step using a Bondo wood filler product, also mixed with graphite to create a black filling material similar to the wood glue. There's an edge knot that I'll do a little bit of filling on. Here I'm putting in a screw into that portion of the knot that was missing material so that I have a mechanical connection for the filler to attach to. I made this routing template out of a mild steel flat bar to route out the pockets for the steel tubes. And again, make sure that the pockets are consistently the right size, for the one tube as well as the other 4.
Boy, did I screw up. Could have done without that. Jeez, I'm an idiot.
Oh boy, sometimes when you buy cheap tools, you get cheap results. This little Harbor Freight palm router couldn't hold on to the bit. I even tightened it so hard that I bent the little wrench that came with it, and it just, the chuck couldn't hold on to the bit, so the bit walked out, and as you can see, the cut quality is terrible. Luckily, this will still be usable, but I'm gonna throw this router in the garbage where it belongs and go buy a better one. Now it's time to drill the bolt holes through the tabletop, but how do I keep the holes straight? Well, another 3D printed fixture.
Look at that.
Steady as a rock.
Yeah, but I shoot with this hand.
Here I'll be applying polyurethane oil-based over the stain to create a seal or barrier from what I've read online. You're supposed to do that before applying epoxy to the top because the epoxy won't stick well to the stain. So I'm trusting that information, putting on the oil-based. Another note here, I'm adding a black pigment to the polyurethane, and I will be adding it to the epoxy as well to try to create more of a depth or a darker look to it rather than just a perfectly clear epoxy top, which I think it would clash a little bit with the kind of rustic style here. So I think the darkness will be ultimately a good decision, but we will see. These bolts stick up a bit too far, so I'm going to cut them off flush with the grinder. Now, all of this work you've seen was just for the bottom of the table, so it's time to flip it over and get started on the top. And thankfully my neighbor Dean came over to help me out with this because this tabletop weighs about 200 pounds.